Corey, what question haven't we asked you that we should ask you
Wow.
about interviewing?
Oh, about interviewing. Okay, because that's a different thing from interviewing versus my life. You know what? I would say, because it depends, because I know we're trying to talk more for the people when they're doing the interview, when they're conducting, what have you. But one question that I get asked not all the time, but somewhat often, but I think it's an important question, is how do you schedule the interviews in the first place? So how do you get the attention of a big name thought leader? Like, what is it, just magic? Like, or is it just that you got lucky, or how do you do that? I think that's a really big one. And I mean, if you're okay with me tackling that one, I can tell you real quick.
Yeah.
That'd
So
be great.
honestly, first of all, I often talk about what I call the domino effect. So I always say it's a reverse domino. The biggest one is the hardest one to push over. And so just like that, I say if you're trying to reach an influencer, convince them to come on your show, the hardest one is always going to be the first one. So you might have to run and jump against that domino to knock it over, to knock the next one over. And so first of all, it's just recognizing it's going to be hard, but it's going to get easier. So what I did is, the first one for me was Jack Canfield. And what's fascinating to me about that interview is that I had no listeners. I hadn't launched yet. And I was going to his team. And, this is at a time Jack's doing Larry King Live, Super Soul Sunday with Oprah. And here goes this guy from a small town, no listeners. But I didn't focus on the no listeners because they asked that less often back then. And he wasn't doing podcasts either. But what I did was, so this is, I guess, a sort of a hack for how I got the interview, but it ties into what I recommend people do. And so they told me, Corey, it's probably going to be a no. I still have this interview. He's turning down 9 out of every 10 interviews because he has nothing to promote. And I thought, okay, how can I be creative? And to make a long story very short, I reached out once a month for 3 months. And then I said, you know what I need to do? I need to find out who I can get to that knows Jack, that will say Jack should be on your show. So, and you'll know this person, I'm sure, Jeff, but I did a little bit of research and I found a testimonial on Jack's website by a guy named Dan Sullivan, strategic coach. And so what I did was I went and found out where Dan was going to be that I could reach out. And so I noticed he was on the latest issue of Success Magazine with Darren Hardy. And this was back in the old CD days. I put it in, I listened to the interview, and I'm like, Darren interviews in a similar style to me. And at the end, Dan said, this was my favorite interview I've ever done in my life. So I took a clip of that and I took my own interview to show them that it was a similar style. And they said, I think you're right. Dan would like this show. Got Dan on the show, brought up Jack 3 or 4 times, just in casual. And it made sense because Dan did I forget what it's called, but he had the event that he did with his weekend where Joe Polish went, and Mark and Jack both went every time. And so I brought up Jack in those ways. And Dan said, Corey, Jack would love being in the show. And you tell him Dan said so. So I took that clip and I sent it to Jack's team, and their words were something like, Corey, you've beaten us into submission. Here's Jack's scheduling link. And then I did the interview, and to have a great close to the what happened as a result is the day it aired, because we used to interview every second Saturday. The day it aired, the day before he was on Larry King Live, and the day after he was on with Oprah on Super Soul Sunday. And in between, he was on my tiny show with no listeners. By the way, our first episode got 5,000 listeners. So we did actually bring the audience, but we never promised them we would. That leads into, to get the big name interviews, what I did was I went and found out somebody else he knew when I couldn't reach Jack. Got Dan on, and now here's what gets really cool. Now I could go to Mark Victor Hansen and say, Mark, we've had Jack, your former writing partner, Dan, your coach, on the show. Would love to have you on the show. And if I remember correctly, Mark said something like, sure, I'd love to be on the show with my friends. I always thought that was a powerful line. And so we got Mark on, and now we have 3 people, and now I can go to somebody else who may not even be in their circle, and they're going, well, if the 2 guys from Chicken Soup and the Soul and Dan Sullivan already went on the show, we can trust this guy. And so you can see where it goes from there. It builds and builds. But I think the creativity now is, how do you reach them before somebody else? So one thing a person can do is go on, let's say, Amazon, and you can find Coming Soon, and you can go back to like 8 months in advance of a book being dropped, and find out Matthew McConaughey has a book coming out in 8 months. Your best chance to reach him is before he scheduled all his interviews. So I think you need to go, as Ziegler used to say, dig your well before you're thirsty. Go start building the relationship before you need it. And so to me, those are some hacks. Find people that have endorsed them or that are in their circle, get access to them. Also, like I say, Amazon, go on to Coming Soon. Another thing I use is hunter.io. There's a lot of these sites, but hunter.io, you can go in and drop the website of the person. And what it'll do is it'll go back and see any email addresses it can find associated with that person across the web. So maybe they only ever put it on once and then never shared it again. And so I was at the VCon conference last year, and I wanted to interview people, and I found out the day before that we were allowed to reach out to the people. I thought we had to wait until they assigned them. And then I'm like, well, I don't have anything lined up. So I went into hunter.io and I popped in impact theory, and I was able to schedule an interview with Tom Bilyeu. And then I did the same with John Taffer from Bar Rescue. And so I ended up, and then the other one was Cesar Milan, so the dog whisperer. And that was all literally within 24 hours by popping the email. And what I did was I put it in hunter.io, I put the URL, and it came up with like 8 emails, and I didn't know who was who, and I only had a short amount of time. So I just literally sent it to all of them and said, not sure who I should reach out to about this, hoping you can redirect me. And so again, Jeff, I know that was a long tangent, but that's some of the hacks that I use to get those early interviews. And then when you have enough, then you can start leveraging those for other ones. And then also when you've done enough, you start getting clips of people saying, this was my favorite interview. And then you put together a little promo video and people watch that and jump in.
Yeah, there's so much in there. And I love just the audacity to be willing to go after those big people too, right? Like, even if you don't have the listeners, going after it. Hey, Launch family. Wasn't that a great clip? If you want to see more of these clips, or maybe you want to check out some of the full episodes that we have, hit subscribe. And we also have some absolutely free, amazing launch resources over at getyouLaunched.com. So go check that out. I think you'll really dig it. Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you on the next episode.